Hi, and welcome back to that JORVIK Viking Thing podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Schmiederer. In Viking times, a thing was a gathering, a place where leaders and warriors could meet and talk. In the 21st century, our thing is a virtual place where Viking academics and enthusiasts from around the world can come together to share knowledge. You might have heard Season 1, and if you haven't, now's your time to catch up. For Season 2, we're taking a deep dive into the Coppergate dig, the groundbreaking dig that captured the attention of royalty, academics, and the public alike. Each episode will take a look at an aspect of the Coppergate dig, from the history of the dig itself to the remarkable artifacts that were uncovered there. We'll speak to Viking-era experts, including some of our own Viking interpreters from here at the JORVIK Viking Center. This series will be 5 episodes. We'll be releasing one a week starting the 23rd of April 2021. So hold on to your helmets and make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss a single episode of that JORVIK Viking Thing podcast. In 1976, an old Victorian sweet factory located on Coppergate in the center of York was slated for demolition. As part of the construction agreement, archaeologists were on hand to make sure that nothing deemed historically significant would be destroyed in the process. What lay only inches beneath the concrete foundations, however, would change our understanding of Vikings and their impact on Britain forever.
When, in the mid-1970s, the old Craven's sweet factory was demolished at Coppergate, trial excavations began to immediately reveal Viking Age remains under the cellar floors of the old buildings, which stood on the site. To everyone's amazement, wooden buildings standing up to 2 meters high, all perfectly preserved, their carpentry details intact, began to be revealed.
That is the voice of Peter Adaman, the founding director of the York Archaeological Trust, who oversaw the Coppergate excavation. For this episode, we scoured our archives and pulled out some voices from the past. We'll hear firsthand about the excavation from people who were directly involved, including more from Peter. Up until this point, York was known for its Roman archaeology, and the only Viking-era artifacts found in York were chance finds. They never offered much insight into the Viking Age. But in 1972, the same year York Archaeological Trust was established, a small-scale excavation took place on Pavement Street, just one street over from Coppergate. Peter remembers it well.
Evidence from this dig suggested that the Viking Age was the period when that part of central York was first laid out and developed. More than that, it showed that the remains were miraculously well preserved, with wooden buildings, textiles, leatherwork, even plant remains, human coprolites and insect remains, all surviving in recognizable form after 1,100 years. The dig at Lloyd's Bank Pavement showed that more extensive excavations in this area could potentially provide Britain's first detailed knowledge of a major Viking town, and of Viking Age buildings and ways of life, and of the Viking contribution to urbanization in York.
This small glimpse into Viking-era York gave archaeologists a peek at a wealth of information that was still contained in the soil. Up to 9 meters of archaeology, most of it from the Viking Age, lay in moist, peaty soil. We'll discuss the science of this waterlogged soil in one of our later episodes, but it was these conditions that preserved the organic remains so well. At most archaeological sites, organic material like timber, textiles, even leather would rot away to nothing, but not here in York. Thanks to the excavations at Lloyd's Bank, we knew the Coppergate dig was going to be something special. In 1976, after the Craven Sweets factory was pulled down, ground broke on this new, exciting excavation.
Amazingly, the City Council acquired an old factory in Coppergate and determined to pull it down and develop it as a shopping centre. And we thought, wow, if it's the same as Lloyd's Bank, that could be a huge opportunity. I remember going to the head of planning in the City Council saying, what are you proposing to do with this site in the meantime? Well, we won't be really excavating it, developing it for several years. We've now acquired it and we're developing a scheme for a shopping centre. And we said, well, how about knocking it down now? How would we do that? I said, well, so you could actually avoid any delay from archaeology when the development took place. Yes, think about it. And I went and nobbled a few councillors who were on our committee and said, look, let's get this damn thing demolished and do an excavation there. And a long story short, amazingly, they said that we could have it for 2 years and they would demolish it and handed it over.
The dig was extended to cover 1,000 square meters, an area the size of 4 tennis courts, allowing archaeologists to trawl their way through 2,000 years of history. But it wasn't simply digging down through the layers to go further back in time, as Peter explains here.
I think we concentrated initially on the area at the front of the site, so far as I recall, because it turned out that the site had been, in the Middle Ages, sloping down to the River Foss nearby. The Viking levels were clear at the front where the cellars had taken us straight down to them, but at the back all the medieval layers survived. So the excavation developed over several years, in fact, and it involved work at the front quite rapidly on the Viking Age buildings, but at the back I had carefully to strip off 16th century and then 15th century and 14th century, etc., until we came at the back, and this was a year or two later, I suppose, down to a very thick layer of 11th, 12th century material, and this had apparently been tipped to bring the site level up to a reasonably flat surface on which you could build, and the various building plots at the front ran back with little alleyways and little fences between them down the slope. So eventually, we were in the Viking Age at the front, and then several hundred years later at the back. Quite a complicated thing to control, and of course a large number of people were required for it.
What was supposed to be a 6-month dig ended up lasting from 1976 until 1981, and hundreds of people came from all over the world to help excavate. The first and most important person to hire, though, would be an excavation director. Richard Hall, a former PhD student of Peter Adaman, got the job. Known for his Viking expertise, he was the perfect person for the role. But it wasn't only his knowledge of the past that was important. Being able to bring together people in the present was critical as well, as Peter remembers.
Richard was very good at creating a team and a team spirit and getting everybody, happily engaged.
Sadly, Richard passed away in 2011, but he left behind a host of colleagues and fellow archaeologists who fondly remember him, as you'll hear throughout this episode. Obviously, Richard couldn't dig the entire site by himself. The York Archaeological Trust had up to a dozen full-time archaeologists on this project at any time, all of them reporting right to Richard. One of these archaeologists was Neil Rogers.
I arrived at Coppergate in 1979 as an 18-year-old, having just completed my A-levels and secured my place to study archaeology at Durham. How better than to start my year off than to spend 2 months digging at the famed Coppergate site? It was a real eye-opener. The size and depth of the site was simply staggering, with a metal piling supporting the sides and a hive of activity within it.
In addition to the full-time archaeologists, hundreds of students and amateur archaeologists from all over the world came to volunteer their time on the excavation. For another archaeologist, Julian Richards, working on Coppergate was the start of a decades-long career in archaeology.
Working on Coppergate was a brilliant apprenticeship for a budding archaeologist. The fine stratigraphy of the street front tenements was incredible. Floor layers of silt, clay and ash were often only centimetres thick, but told a story of the occupation and use of the workshops. They demanded painstaking stratigraphic excavation, and in order to make sense of them you had to understand what was going on.
But it wasn't just professional and student archaeologists that excavated. As part of their community engagement, York Archaeological Trust welcomed inmates on day release from some neighboring prisons to join them on the excavation. More than once they proved their value, as Julian also remembers.
At one stage, some of the inmates of Askham Bryan Open Prison were allowed to work on the dig, helping with some of the manual tasks. They also had some specific skills which came in handy one morning. The site was closed with a padlock on the main gate, and that day Richard Hall, the site director, had forgotten his keys. The whole dig team was waiting outside, and Richard was getting very angry with himself about the lost working time and was about to set off home to find his keys. However, the prisoners told him not to worry and went into a huddle around the gate. In less than a minute, the lock had been picked and the gate was open.
Work on the site was a hard, laborious job. Aside from the grueling task of slowly scraping away wet soil inch by inch, other tasks had to be done as well. The excavated earth needed to be removed from the ever-expanding excavation site, and as the site grew deeper and deeper, they simply couldn't be throwing it over the side of the trench. Instead, more creative measures had to be taken, with some hiccups along the way. Julian recalls one such time.
By the time the excavation had reached Viking layers, the site was already very deep, and an electric bucket hoist was used to remove the excavated soil. The winch had hooks which could take 4 buckets at a time, and it was the job of one of the summer volunteers to attach the 4 buckets to the hooks so that they could be lifted clear of the dig. Unfortunately, one day he also attached one of the hooks to his trouser belt, although the first we knew of it was his shouts as he was hoisted several metres into the air like a circus performer. He was eventually returned safely to Earth.
But the grueling work paid off, and only days into the excavation, traces of Viking-age timbers were discovered.
And so there was an old pub on there called the White Horse. They had cellars at the front. And I said, right, Richard, now is your chance to show whether or not this is a site. Just lift the floor of the cellars and see what there is there. And immediately underneath there were timber remains of buildings end on to the street. And this first sort of trial excavation produced the first decent townhouses from the Viking York, or indeed from 10th century Britain.
Archaeologist Nicky Rogers was fortunate enough to help excavate some of these timbers.
I started off working at the back of the site, but after a couple of weeks I was moved up to the front, working within one of the tenements. There were wooden structural remains around the sides and a huge amount of brushwood on the floor area, which took a long time to fully reveal.
The wooden remains are some of the most important finds that came from Coppergate. York Archaeological Trust was able to preserve thousands of pieces of wood, everything from wattle that was woven together to make walls and pathways, to larger timbers used to build houses, even simple everyday wooden cups and bowls that give Coppergate, the street of the cup makers, its name. In the 1970s, however, British archaeologists did not have much experience with preserving thousand-year-old wooden objects. It was up to Jim Spriggs, conservator at York Archaeological Trust, to determine how best to save these priceless artefacts.
The waterlogging at Coppergate had caused the spectacular survival of the original timbers and wattle and daub that made up the buildings and structures that stood on the site in the Viking period. Indeed, they started appearing within days of beginning work, and we immediately knew that we'd found something of extraordinary archaeological significance. For me, the excitement was slowly tempered by the realisation that I was chiefly responsible for looking after all this wood, both on site during excavation, then getting it lifted and stored safely, and probably then also conserving it permanently.
Later on this season, we'll be exploring the science behind not only the soil and how it preserved these artifacts, but also the new techniques and technologies that Jim and other conservators at Coppergate were able to come up with. For the archaeologists on site, there was one simple instruction that they had to remember, and Nicky remembers it well.
Every so often Richard Hall would come along and see how work was progressing. His frequent instruction to me was, keep that wood wet.
Richard Hall was involved in every aspect of the dig, from organizing what volunteers would work on to overseeing the excavation and preservation of all the artifacts coming up out of the ground. He even went on daily tours of the site. Most of these tours were uneventful, but Julian remembers one that was a little bit more eventful than usual.
Richard Hall had the habit of going for a tour of the site towards the end of each working day, getting an update on progress from each of the excavation assistants and writing up his site diary. I was working on one of the street front tenements at the time and was steadily troweling my way down through the thin occupation levels. Richard stopped beside me and asked for an update. I started to tell him about the sequence of layers, but then spotted that he was standing on a pewter Viking disc brooch which had just been exposed on the surface. It survived the experience and is on display in the JORVIK Museum, minus the nick taken out of one corner where Richard's boot had come to rest.
By the time the excavation wrapped up, archaeologists had uncovered 4.5 tons of animal bones, 230,000 individual pieces of pottery, 750,000 oyster shells, and thousands upon thousands of objects from the everyday life of the Vikings who lived right there on Coppergate. Archaeologists had also taken 12 tons of soil samples for further analysis, as well as 11,000 drawings from different archaeological features to provide context for all of these discoveries. Peter gives us a little perspective on all of these amazing finds.
What were the most memorable finds? It's difficult to select when there were more than 39,000 of them, but a squashed beehive, complete with well-preserved bees, stands out in my mind. All the various evidence for coin production, including the immensely rare dies for striking Viking Age coins, and lead trowel pieces for featuring strikings from other dies. These opened a window on Viking Age commerce. What was the most memorable day? That came after the main dig ended, as the site was being developed, when the famous Coppergate helmet was found. Arguably the finest Anglo-Saxon helmet ever discovered, and certainly the best preserved.
Make sure you tune in for our next episode, where we'll discuss some of these famous finds with one of our Viking interpreters here at the JORVIK Viking Center. As mentioned before, this excavation was not hidden away from the public. Instead, the Coppergate excavation welcomed more than 500,000 visitors to view the archaeologists as they worked. Peter explains the setup.
So I said, okay, Richard, now we have a problem. It's a huge site. It's going to be really expensive. So while he was continuing to do the work on the little areas in the front, which had got down to Viking levels because of the cellars, we started to talk to our friends at the fundraising group at Borrowing Communications. And I think we'd also been saying, we really need to get more funds into York. And I remember their officer who was in charge of our account saying to me, we really need to publicise something that will grab the attention of the public if we're going to have a proper fundraising campaign. Tell us what you're digging. And I said, we're digging the College of the Vicars Choral of the Minster. What's that? He said. And I said, well, it's where the priests who used to do the singing the services, deputising for canons, used to live. He said. What else? And I said, we've got quite a large excavation going on the Roman legionary fortress. Oh, he said, that's a bit more interesting. We might be able to do something with that. Anything else? And I said, we just found all these Viking buildings on the street front in Coppergate. He said, Vikings, yeah. They've got sex appeal. I think I could do Vikings. So that was the first sort of pushing the Viking theme of York, which very few people knew anything about at all at that stage. So developed this initiative of Viking finds, and the press and the television fell for it. They started covering everything that Richard found, and some of the things were great. They were quite unique, and you could make an awful lot out of a complete Viking shoe, especially if it was a recognisable and a nice design and so on. And so that began this PR exercise, and having actually started that theme, I've got to get the public involved. We've got to get them onto the site, and I said to Richard, we've got to get public on the site. Never. And eventually we did, and the site had a sort of walkway around the edge, and people were charged I don't know what it would be in those days, but £1, I suppose, nowadays to go and look. Eventually we got them there, and placards on the front, and quite large numbers of people coming to see it.
From the very beginning, York Archaeological Trust has been bringing archaeology to the public. It's hard to believe, but back in the 1970s, most people weren't too interested in archaeology, especially here in York. To adults especially, these excavations got in the way of their usual business and construction projects. Instead of trying to make them understand the value of archaeology, Peter tried a different approach, as he explains here.
It was a question of changing perceptions and winning minds and influencing people. It struck me that one of the quickest ways to a person's heart is through its child. And one of the first appointments we made in setting up staff for the York Archaeological Trust was a lovely lady called Mrs. Gota. She's now a very mature elderly lady, but she was quite a feisty ex-teacher. And I said, Sheila, we're going to do excavations around the city. I would like you, if possible, to get each school to send visitors visitors to see the digs, and if not, perhaps you could go and give them a little talk about what we're finding. Sheila managed to develop this educational program so that in the first excavations there was always a viewing platform where kids could come, and Sheila would come in 2 or 3 schools a day with 20 kids and enthuse them, let them handle artifacts and so on, and we found that they would go back and tell their parents and what a terrific time they'd had on this dig, and that was straight into the community. So there was a broadly based campaign of getting archaeology to be a good thing rather than a bad thing, and something that everybody knew about and everybody wanted to happen, so that if, for example, a city centre site was to be developed by the corporation, city councillors would know that actually to do the dig first would be quite a popular thing to do, a sensible thing to do.
The tactic worked. Not only did 500,000 people visit the Coppergate excavation, but since then, the JORVIK group has welcomed countless schools through our doors, even starting a new digital format in recent years for schools that can't make it to us. Instead, our Viking interpreters connect with them through Skype and Zoom, bringing children from all over the world face to face with our Viking past. Alongside members of the public, members of royalty across Europe were interested in the site as well.
We need a distinguished group to sponsor it and a major fundraising campaign. We're going to have to heighten the profile of this. Who's the most famous archaeologist in Britain? Famous, they're not really famous. The Prince of Wales did an archaeology degree at Cambridge. Well, that's right, he'll start with him then. That is really, I suppose, possible. And so I wrote some silly letter to the equerry, and they then said, yes, but that's an honorary committee. Who's the more practical, sort of down-to-earth? Well, I did read archaeology at Cambridge with Princess Margareta, who's now the Queen of Denmark. You could get her. I said, I think probably you would, yes. So I set off to Amalienborg Palace, and she said, I'd love to do that. So we had the Queen of Denmark, which was very, very relevant.
Famously, Prince Charles visited the site and became one of its patrons. However, interest in this incredible Viking site soon spread to Scandinavia and their royal families. Queen Margaretha II of Denmark visited the site in 1980, but was a patron long before that. King Carl XVI Gustaf of Sweden, as well as King Harald V of Norway, who was still crown prince during the excavation, both were patrons as well, though they didn't visit the site in person. The Coppergate excavation was possible only through the support of these visitors. The original excavation was only supposed to last 6 months, so funding was an ongoing issue. But along with paid tours, visitors had the chance to purchase souvenirs from the site, including some of the 750,000 oyster shells that we dug up. Not exactly best practice today, but there were certainly shells to spare in these trenches. The popularity of the Coppergate excavation proved one thing. People wanted more Vikings. As the excavation ended and the shopping center started construction, plans to create a museum were drawn up. But this museum wouldn't be the usual visitor experience, full of glass cabinets and blank white walls. Instead, the JORVIK Viking Center was built underground on the site of not just the excavation, but of the original Viking-era street. Opening in April 1984, visitors boarded time cars, the predecessor of the time capsules we use today, and they rode through a recreation of Coppergate, experiencing the sights, sounds, and most famously the smells as the Vikings would have known them. As it turns out, the smells were memorable for the archaeologists as well, as both Neil and Julian remember.
Once when I was excavating in one of the wicker-lined pits on a hot July day, the smell of rotten waterlogged organic material, probably poo, was still lingering.
One of the abiding memories for the diggers was the ripe smell of many of the Viking cesspits, as recreated in JORVIK. Once the capping had been removed, the cess layers were often as smelly and ripe as if they had been deposited that day.
Behind the scenes, countless people were involved in the 3-year project to design and build the JORVIK Viking Center. Alongside the archaeologists, conservators, and scholars, specialist thatchers, potters, sailmakers, sculptors, taxidermists, silversmiths, wood carvers, leather workers, and of course, coppers were enlisted to recreate what life was like 1,000 years ago. Since 1984, almost 20 million people have visited the JORVIK Viking Center, each taking away their own memories and experiences. Many people remember the artifacts, the ride, and yes, the smells. But for everyone involved in the JORVIK Viking Center, from the excavation to the museum today, it's the people that they remember. Our last voices are those of Nikki and Neil Rogers, who met on the excavation and made a lasting connection.
Working on excavations is a very sociable experience, and friends are often made on them. In my case, I also met my future husband. 9 years later, I was appointed to the post of artefact researcher at York Archaeological Trust and returned to York in 1988, and I've worked as an archaeologist in the city ever since.
I particularly enjoyed the international team activity and such friendly people. I made friends with people of all ages from Sweden, Denmark and the USA. Coppergate resulted in several long-lasting relationships, and I met my future wife there. Coppergate wasn't just about making amazing archaeological discoveries.
We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the Coppergate excavation. Special thanks go to Peter Adaman, Julian Richards, Neil Rogers, Nikki Rogers, and Jim Spriggs for lending their voices and memories to this episode. Today, we're going to talk about the Viking Age finds that were uncovered in the dig. Over the course of the 5-year excavation, millions of objects were recovered from the soil. 4.5 tons of animal bones, 750,000 oyster shells, and 20,000 individual artifacts were recovered. Coppergate is best known for the Viking objects that were uncovered there, and only a small portion of these artifacts can be displayed in our museum. But today, we wanted to focus on some of the most spectacular Viking finds. We have with us today Rachel Cutler, interpretation assistant and one of our Viking interpreters from the JORVIK Viking Center, to share with us what she knows about 4-star Viking finds from the Coppergate dig. We'll start off with possibly the most famous item found in the dig, the Coppergate helmet. What can you tell us about the helmet, Rachel?
The Coppergate helmet is not actually a Viking helmet, but an Anglian helmet excavated during the watching brief right at the end of the Coppergate dig in 1982, when planning was underway to develop the site into the shopping centre that it is today. By Anglian, we mean the period in post-Roman Britain when the Germanic people known as the Angles settled in the north and east of England, as opposed to the Saxons who settled in parts of the south and southeast of England. What we call the Anglian period of the history of the north of England covers roughly from the 5th and 6th centuries up until the mid-9th century, when large waves of Scandinavian people came to live in these parts also. But of course, when Scandinavian people settled in areas such as York, the Anglian people continue to live here also. Hence, Anglo-Scandinavian is a better term to describe the late 9th and 10th centuries, rather than just Anglian or Anglo-Saxon or Viking, because we have a lot of evidence from archaeology of the two cultures mixing. The Coppergate helmet was found in a wood-lined pit in a Viking Age back garden. Although the pit itself was created in the Anglo-Scandinavian period and has been dated to sometime around the year 900, the helmet itself is pre-Viking and has been dated to 750 to 775. So by the time it was buried in this pit, it was a century old. It was clearly used. It shows wear and has been damaged by a sharp projectile, unlike the Sutton Hoo helmet, which seems to have been a king's ceremonial helmet and shows no battle scarring. The survival of the Coppergate helmet is incredibly lucky. It narrowly missed destruction by a massive brick chimney in the 19th century, and then it was nearly destroyed by a mechanical digger when it was found in 1982. The Coppergate helmet is one of only 5 Anglo-Saxon helmets ever found, and it's the most complete and the best preserved of them all. It is a mystery how the helmet came to its final resting place, however, but one possibility is that it might have been worn during the struggle for York between the Vikings and the Northumbrians in 866. The helmet was constructed out of iron, with cheek pieces like a Roman helmet and a chainmail neck guard. When it was found, one cheek piece was still attached, whereas the other cheek piece and the mail neck guard had been placed within the helmet. This chainmail neck guard was constructed out of around 2,000 rings, so this is also a really rare and exciting survival of chainmail from this period. Unlike the Sutton Hoo helmet, this helmet does not cover the majority of the wearer's face, but it does have a nasal guard, which is a brass strip running downwards from between the eyes to cover the nose. The helmet has copper alloy fittings, such as eyebrows with animal heads at each end, and a separately cast animal head above the nasal guard. The copper alloy decoration on the helmet is incredibly intricate and it's really beautifully made. There's a variety of different animal heads and really lovely interlaced designs. In addition to all this decoration that you would see if you were facing somebody wearing the helmet, on top there are also brass strips across the top of the skull forming the shape of a cross. On these brass strips we can read an inscription in Latin. In English, this inscription says, "In the name of our Lord Jesus, the Holy Spirit, God the Father, and with all we pray. Amen, Osher, XPI." So XPI is the first three letters of Christ in Greek. Osher is an Old English personal name. Osher is thought to maybe be the owner of the helmet, although he might have been the craftsman or maybe even the man who commissioned it as a gift. This helmet is clearly high status, made for an important person, so perhaps it might have been worn by a royal ruler of the Kingdom of Northumbria, but Osher's identity remains a mystery. The inscription on the helmet is clearly a Christian one. Northumbria had been Christian for at least 100 years by the time this helmet was made. The prayer could be an attempt to reinforce the helmet's physical protection with spiritual protection from God. Aside from the inscription on the Coppergate helmet, the design is similar to that of the Wollaston helmet, which is another Anglo-Saxon helmet excavated in Northamptonshire, except the Coppergate helmet is much more richly decorated, and the Wollaston helmet has a little boar at the top of the skull, so quite different. The helmet was in really good condition when it was excavated, despite being filled with clay soil, but the lack of oxygen in the waterlogged soil had prevented the metal of the helmet from corroding. The archaeologists were concerned that drying out the helmet would cause all of the clay inside the helmet to be too hard to remove. So instead of excavating it straight away, the section of earth containing the helmet was lifted carefully from the pit, and the helmet was stored wet with all this earth until it could be properly investigated. The helmet was x-rayed to see if there was anything in the helmet along with all the mud and clay, and indeed this x-ray revealed the missing cheek piece and the chainmail neck guard. So the next job was to remove the damp clay and the soil from inside the helmet, which was done really slowly and carefully. The helmet was then restored at the British Museum. An iron plate from the top of the helmet, which had been damaged, was carefully refitted, and the chainmail neck guard was reattached, and the second cheek piece was also reattached.
If you look at the helmet today, you'll notice that it looks quite different than most of our other objects. Because the helmet was such a significant find, the York City Council decided to restore the helmet rather than simply conserve it. When restoring an artifact, specialists will work to restore the piece to its original appearance and function, including adding new bits if necessary. On the Coppergate helmet, you can see these new bits clearly, as they don't have the same decoration as the original parts of the helmet. Conservation, on the other hand, focuses on maintaining the piece as is, so that future generations will be able to enjoy the item for years to come. We'll talk more about conservation work in episode 4 of this season. As we've mentioned before, Vikings have been associated with fighting for a very long time, and you might think that finding the Coppergate helmet would only reinforce that image. Aside from the helmet, we found a spearhead, some fragments of a sword, and a seax, a type of knife with a single-edged blade. All of these items sound like they'd be perfect on the battlefield, but actually, most of them are far more domestic in use than you might think. The seax, in particular, may sound rather threatening, especially since we found hundreds of seax sheaths on Coppergate, but really, it's just a big knife that a lot of Saxons during that time period carried around with them. They would use a seax to cut their food, cut leather, even butcher an animal. If necessary, people could use a seax to defend themselves, but rarely did these items see the battlefield, at least from the residents of JORVIK. But the Anglo-Scandinavians of JORVIK had more than just these potential weapons. Coppergate gave us a look into clothing they wore as well. The prized artifact in this collection is a mostly complete woolen sock, affectionately known as the Coppergate sock. Can you tell us more, Rachel?
So the Coppergate sock is the only Viking sock ever found. It was excavated in a pit in the mid-10th century levels of Coppergate. The sock isn't a long sock or a stocking, it stops at the ankle, so it was quite small to look at, but it would fit somebody with a UK size 8 foot. This sock is made with a single needle technique called null binding, which is a Danish term meaning needle binding. It's quite different to knitting and crochet. A single needle is used to make interlocking loops of yarn, and it's a very slow technique, but it can be used to create really warm, hard-wearing small items such as socks as well as hats and mittens. The woolen yarn that this sock is made from is incredibly fine and the stitches are really tiny, so it would have taken many hours of work to produce this one sock. There is a long history of null binding in continental Europe in the Middle Ages. In the Viking period, there are 2 examples of null-binded mittens from Iceland and a cap from 9th or 10th century Egypt. But there are no other null-binded socks, and there's very little evidence of this craft in Britain. Therefore, it has been suggested that this sock arrived in York on the foot of a Scandinavian settler. That said, in the excavation we also found some bone needles that could easily have functioned as null-binding needles, so it could have been made here in York. There are lots of different types of stitches in null binding, some creating much thicker and tougher fabrics than others, but the type of stitch that was used to make this sock is unique and it's been named the York stitch. From my own experience of null binding, York stitch is perfect for making socks because it is really dense and hard wearing, but still has a little bit of stretch to help pull the socks on and off. This sock is made of undyed wool with a red band at the top. Null binding does not unravel like knitting or crochet, so no special finishing border is needed, so this last red row could have been a decorative edge. But the sock might not always have been an ankle sock. It could have actually continued upwards as a stocking, but was later trimmed. This band of red at the top could be all that was left of the rest of the sock being made from red wool, or perhaps other colours were originally present too. If you view the sock in the JORVIK galleries, you can tell that this was a very well-used item. It has been darned in places, and there are some holes that were left unrepaired before it ended up in the ground, and of course we don't know where the second sock is. On the ball of the foot of this sock, you can see an outline of stitches showing where there was probably once a large rectangular patch sewn to cover a hole, but that patch is now missing. A question we often get asked at JORVIK is, did every Viking wear socks? It's impossible to say whether socks were a common garment in the Viking Age, because socks and other textile remains do not usually survive in archaeology, and socks are also hard to distinguish in images from this period. At Coppergate, the waterlogged soil has meant that the sock and other textile remains were really well preserved.
The Coppergate sock has actually been named one of the most important artifacts in the North as part of A History of the North in 100 Objects. It's an initiative that encourages visitors to explore history's greatest treasures as part of the Great Exhibition of the North. The red dye used on the top part of the Coppergate sock was actually a fairly common color in JORVIK. Made from a plant called madder, more traces of this dye were found than any other dye material. Other colors that residents of JORVIK were wearing included blue, yellow, and green, making it a very colorful place indeed. Aside from the sock, bits of linen, woolen, and even silk textiles were found during the excavation, though most were only small fragments. A golden brown silk headdress was found. It's unlikely that silk was made on Coppergate, so this cap probably came to York by traders from the east. Further evidence that York was a busy center of trade amongst the Vikings. In addition to the finished products, archaeologists found many artifacts used in the production of textiles. Raw wool itself managed to survive 1,000 years in the wet soil, as well as flax used to make linen. Spindles and spindle whorls, both used in spinning, were found in droves during the excavation. Even pieces of looms were found, meaning that every part of the textile production happened on Coppergate, from washing the wool all the way up to the weaving of the cloth. And of course, mending too. We know that thanks to the 243 needles that were found on the site. It's very clear that the Vikings had a make, do, and mend sort of attitude towards their possessions, and this extended not just to their clothes, but to their cooking utensils as well. Rachel, can you tell us a little bit about the Coppergate frying pan?
This frying pan is one of the many domestic artefacts and cooking utensils excavated from Anglo-Scandinavian Coppergate, and it resembles a modern wok. The pan is made from a single sheet of iron that was beaten into shape. You can see the marks from the hammer on the inner surface, particularly around the rim. It originally would have had a handle nailed to the inside of the pan, which is unfortunately now missing, but you can see 2 terminal plates to attach the handle. In comparison to other metal cooking vessels from Viking Age Scandinavia, this frying pan is unusual because it is shaped and used like a frying pan, whereas Scandinavian examples tend to be more like cauldrons with drop handles. In the Coppergate dig, we found 5 other fragments which might have been from similar vessels, but it's really difficult to tell whether they would have actually been a frying pan in shape. A similar frying pan to this one was, however, excavated in Winchester, and this one had a long handle with a loop at the end to hang it up. So perhaps cooking with a frying pan was more of a Saxon technique that later spread to York. The most interesting thing about this frying pan is that it was patched and repaired multiple times throughout its life. There are 2 patching plates which were riveted in place to cover large holes. One of these is made from iron and the other is made from lead, which may not have been the best choice for something to prepare food from. There are another 7 additional rivets to cover smaller holes. A large metal item like this pan probably would have been a big investment, so repairs like this were essential for getting as much use out of it as possible.
As well as the frying pan, plenty of other kitchen items were uncovered at Coppergate. Quern stones used to grind cereal grains were made out of limestone, sandstone, and more often than not, lava stone. Bowls were made out of stone, wood, or metal, and cups were commonly made out of wood. Even spoons were found at Coppergate, mostly made out of metal. And of course, hundreds of thousands of pieces of pottery were found. Recently, archaeologists have begun research on pottery fragments like these to determine what the Vikings were eating. Our final object is a little bit different. It was made by a Viking, but in a very special sort of way. Here's Rachel one last time. Rachel, what can you tell us about the Lloyd's Bank coprolite?
This object was not actually excavated in the Coppergate dig, but it is still probably the most famous and most popular artefact on display at JORVIK. The word coprolite comes from the Greek meaning poo stone, and is used to refer to fossilised poo. It is nearly 20 centimetres long and 5 centimetres wide, making it the largest human coprolite ever found. It was unearthed in the excavation underneath Lloyd's Bank on Pavement in York City Centre, which is just around the corner from Coppergate. As well as unearthing this famous faeces, this excavation was important because it revealed that the Anglo-Scandinavian levels at York were incredibly well preserved, and therefore showed that the Coppergate site, which was Craven's sweet factory at the time, had real potential for Anglo-Scandinavian archaeology, just like we talked about in episode 1. Human coprolites can provide information about what people were eating and also provide information about their state of health as well. The Lloyd's Bank coprolite is by no means the only Anglo-Scandinavian poo ever found in York, but since it is not only huge but also all in one piece, it is clearly from one individual, so it gives a fascinating glimpse into this one individual's health and diet. Whereas most of the other coprolite from Lloyd's Bank and other Anglo-Scandinavian sites in York is from mass cesspits, which would have been used by multiple individuals, so all the small pieces of coprolite are mixed up. Human waste does not always survive in archaeology. Quite specific conditions are needed to preserve faeces and turn it into coprolite. Wet waterlogged soil is very helpful for this, as the calcium salts in the water from the wet soil gradually replace some of the organic material in the poo and it becomes mineralised. At Lloyd's Bank Pavement, the ground consisted mostly of richly organic layers with a large amount of incompletely decayed plant matter, which helps explain why the coprolite was so well preserved. The Lloyd's Bank coprolite was excavated at the deepest point of the excavations at Lloyd's Bank, and it was originally thought to be a piece of metalworking waste until biological investigations have shown that it was in fact mineralised human poo. Analysis on this coprolite revealed that it contains a lot of cereal bran. Bran is the hard outer layers of cereal crops, and the human body cannot digest the bran from cereal, so it remains in the poo. The person who deposited the Lloyd's Bank coprolite must have had a really high fibre diet. Other coprolite samples from Anglo-Scandinavian York also contained things like seeds from fruit and vegetables, but the Lloyd's Bank coprolite did not, suggesting that this person had a less healthy and less varied diet. Looking at coprolites is a useful way to understand health and hygiene in the Anglo-Scandinavian period. This coprolite contains the eggs of whipworms and moorworms, telling us that this individual was infested with numerous parasitic worms. These parasites are spread when faeces contaminate food crops or when food is prepared with dirty hands. Having a small number of gutworms isn't usually a problem for healthy individuals, but this person had a particularly large infestation, and this would have caused them serious stomach aches, diarrhoea, and inflammation of the bowel. It's difficult to tell whether the quantity of parasites in this coprolite was typical for this period, or whether this person had an unusually bad infestation. We do know that the person who produced this poo had at least a small number of whipworms and several hundred moorworms. Today that would be classed as a heavy infestation, but it would not necessarily affect the individual's ability to go about with daily life. In other Anglo-Scandinavian sites in York, parasite eggs have also been recovered from coprolite samples in latrine pits or cesspits, and some have also been found on samples of the moss, which would have been used as toilet paper. So we cannot determine whether these other parasite eggs were from multiple individuals or just a small number of individuals, as multiple people would have shared these latrine pits, so their poo got all mixed up.
Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us today, Rachel. Finally, we have an update from our last episode. Peter Adaman, the founding director of York Archaeological Trust, commented on his favourite find from the Coppergate excavation.
What were the most memorable finds? It's difficult to select when there were more than 39,000 of them. but a squashed beehive, complete with well-preserved bees, stands out in my mind.
In researching this episode, we've discovered that this beehive was not, in fact, a beehive. The object recovered was actually a length of twisted rope wound into a pile, surrounded by thousands of fragments of bee wings. It was a reasonable assumption when it was first uncovered that this might have been a domed beehive called a bee skep. However, no further testing has ever been done on the object, as it's gone missing in the nearly 50 years since it was first discovered, but it's unlikely that it was a bee skep. The bees, on the other hand, were still around until the 1980s. When a pair of bee enthusiasts looked closely at the wings, they determined that these bees were the British dark bee, a wild native honeybee. These bees, in fact, were found in numerous places all around Coppergate, along with blocks of beeswax. We now think that the bees were a common insect and that they probably were kept on or near Coppergate. The Vikings very likely kept bees for honey and beeswax, but we don't actually have any evidence of the beehives themselves. Peter also mentioned all the various artifacts related to coin production found at Coppergate, including a slightly confusing coin that isn't quite what it seems. This particular coin is called a dirham, and it was made in the Arabic kingdom of Samarkand, where Uzbekistan is today. Plenty of dirham like this circulated throughout the Viking world, but what makes this one special is that it's not a real dirham. It's a forgery. Not a modern-day forgery, but a 10th century one. It was made from a piece of copper covered in tin to make it look like a genuine silver coin, and it was also stamped with the name of the Caliph of Samarkand, Ismail ibn Ahmed. We think this was minted somewhere near Samarkand, then traveled 3,000 miles across Europe and Scandinavia before it found its final resting place here in JORVIK. Whether or not the Vikings here could tell this was a fake is open for debate, but there was plenty of coins flowing in and out of the city. More than just coins, we found the actual dies that the coins were struck from. A coin die is one of two pieces of metal used to strike a coin. The coin blank, a piece of blank silver in this case, is placed between the dies, which are then struck with a hammer. Take the dies away, and a pattern from the dies has been imprinted onto the coin. These dies were beyond the skill of a regular blacksmith, so it was probably a jeweler or other specialized metal worker who were in charge of creating these dies. One of the dies had a part of it chiseled out, which makes us think it had reached the end of its usefulness and was on its way to being melted down and forged again. How it ended up in the mud and not in the fire is a mystery, but one we're grateful for, since it gives us a tiny peek into how objects like these were used, not just how they were made. In addition to the coin dies, we also found a trial strip of lead that was used to double-check these dies. The metalworker could stamp this lead strip as a means of quality control. Good thing, too, as one of the impressions of this strip turned out backwards. That means the die was completely useless and the poor metalworker had to start all over, making the die from scratch again. It seems like the process of making these coin dies was more intensive than making the coins themselves. This week, we're talking to Dr. Chris Tuckley, Head of Interpretation and Engagement from here at the York Archaeological Trust. He's going to talk to us about some of the spectacular medieval finds from the dig. And we'll learn a little bit more about what was found from the other time periods as well, from the Romans all the way up to the Victorians. So Chris, we know that Coppergate was used by more than just Vikings, so what do you have for us today?
So today we're looking at medieval Coppergate. It's not a period that we look at in any great detail at the JORVIK Viking Centre. And we are in particular looking at some of the most interesting small finds to come out of the medieval levels at Coppergate. The period that we're considering is known by the archaeologists who worked on the Coppergate dig as period 6, and that covers a period from the latter part of the 11th century up to the early post-medieval period, or the early modern period, which falls around about the 16th century. And whereas we think of the Anglo-Scandinavian or the Viking levels at Coppergate being very rich in finds and also in the sort of dark soils, the organic material that's very, very well preserved for the 9th and 10th centuries, actually for the medieval period, it seems that the people who were living along Coppergate cleaned up their act, and there were better systems for taking away waste materials and tidying up, so you don't get the same piling up of rubbish and the same use of open pits for using as toilets and for rubbish disposal. So actually there's less surviving from those later levels than there is from a comparable length of time earlier in the medieval period. And actually, according to what I've been looking at, there were no remains surviving in terms of the street frontage of Coppergate. There were some buildings, or the remains of some buildings, found further back along those plots.
That's so fascinating. I had no idea that we found anything really other than finds from the Viking period.
It's not publicised really, is it? I mean, when we think about the Coppergate dig, we think almost exclusively about the Viking levels. And for anyone who looks into the material that was recovered at the Coppergate dig, you can quickly see that the entirety of York's history is represented within the archaeology there, from the Roman period right up to, the Victorian period, really, and later than that. But we always concentrate, in terms of the interpretation that we do at the JORVIK Viking Centre, on the Viking levels. And so it's the Viking archaeology that the site is known for.
So what's our first medieval find from Coppergate then?
We can consider first the ring that was found, a real luxury item made from very high quality gold, of a better quality than 18 karat gold, as I understand it. So a really refined item, and set with a single pearl and 4 garnets. So presumably this fell off someone's finger at some point during the mid-13th century and landed in a pit. It was found at the site of a pit next to a cobbled path. So some important wealthy person, no doubt, has been ambling along, and they've lost this ring. And this must have been a terrible loss that must have been greatly regretted.
Unfortunate for them, but lucky for us.
Absolutely lucky for us. We now have it to look at. The pearl has been looked at. It's probably a freshwater pearl. And the ring itself is set with, it's got an inlaid pattern in a darker colour. And analysis has shown that this is niello that has been used to decorate the ring. So this is a real luxury item from the medieval period found at Coppergate, and one that isn't particularly well known.
It sounds absolutely gorgeous. What else was found?
So the next artifact is a slightly more practical item. It is part of a box, and it's thought that it's the lid of a box. It's about 55 to 60 centimetres long, about 27 centimetres wide, and it's woven from willow. So it was found in quite a sorry state. It had been squashed out of shape by the weight of the soil that was on top of it. But it was recovered together with some old shoes from an excavated cellar within the remains of a timber-framed building. It was lifted en masse out of the soil, so it was block lifted and taken straight to the lab. And it stands as a unique example of skilled woodworking and basketry techniques of the 13th or 14th century. Now, I guess it would be quite difficult to put something like this on display because of its size and its probable fragility as well, which again is probably why it's not a well-known piece from the Coppergate site. It has a willow frame with jointed corners, and there is space between the slats that were filled with tightly packed woven willow rods. There's no metal at all within the lid, and even the hinges are probably willow rods. So the level of basket working skill and carpentry skill that's gone into this construction is significant. Nothing of the rest of the box remains. It may have been constructed out of wooden planks. No other lid of this type is known in England or Europe, and it's guesswork as to what a box like this with a wickerwork lid would have been used for. Maybe it was like a laundry basket of the kind that we might recognise in our own homes today, which obviously are often constructed of wickerwork.
I've got something just like it at home, but it does sound vaguely familiar to something else.
Well, there is another example of a box lid found at Coppergate. This one is more well known and currently on display at JORVIK. It's from the Viking period, and it is a lid, or at least decoration for a box lid, made from pig's rib bones that have been decorated with incised lines.
It's one of our other star finds at Jorvik, that's right. It's interesting that we found two really unique and completely different box lids at the same site. So what else do you have for us today?
This is the find that my colleagues are most excited about. It's probably the most perfectly preserved medieval bucket in Britain, is how it's been described. And it was found at the bottom of a contemporary well at Coppergate. And the well itself was lined with a barrel or cask. So similar techniques used to construct both the bucket and barrels in that period. Remarkably, both the wooden bucket and its iron chain and fittings have been preserved. So perhaps the chain broke at some point as water was being drawn, or it was accidentally dropped, and it remained buried for 600 years or thereabouts until the archaeologists found it. And when you look at the photographs of the bucket, it looks as good as new. It looks as though you could pick it up and use it to draw water today. Looking closely at the bucket, the conservation team found that it was made of 9 oak uprights called staves that were bound together by 3 iron bands. A handle was fixed through holes that had been pierced in two longer staves whose rounded ends extended beyond the rim. So they do stand proud of the rest of the structure of the bucket. And then these holes have been reinforced with iron plates to take the weight from a chain which was attached to the handle using a swiveling mechanism. So quite a piece of engineering, thought to be of an early 15th century date. And that is based on pottery that was found with the bucket and on the location of the well in relation to other layers on the site. Who would have made a bucket of this kind? Well, it could have been a cooper. Coopers we think of making barrels, particularly for storage, probably working outside the city in woodland areas, so they are close to their raw materials, and travelling into town to sell their items in the markets of York.
Don't forget to check our Instagram at JORVIK Viking, where you can see pictures of this bucket. It really does look like you could just pick it up and use it. Are there any other everyday objects that were found from medieval Coppergate?
A minor and slightly more modest find from Coppergate is a fragment of a piece of pottery. So it's a ceramic item, and it's been suggested that it is part of a plant pot. I don't know, I've probably never imagined that people in the medieval period used plant pots, but of course they did. It stands to reason, doesn't it? Because gardening went on in the medieval period just as it does today. And no doubt people, even in cobbled yards, would have had reason to grow plants, either for practical purposes or for decoration. And also it's quite possible that cut flowers could be sold as well in the city. So no doubt horticulture is going on in the medieval period. It's about 100 mil wide. It's not a fancy piece at all, but it does have part of a human face within the decoration between two of the handles and combed wavy lines. And it's glazed both inside and out.
Of course. It does make sense that they'd be using plant pots for gardening, just like we do today.
It stands to reason, doesn't it? Yes, and when I was saying what I was saying, I did have the courtyard at Barley Hall, our reconstructed medieval townhouse, in my mind's eye as I was thinking about that, and the way in which we often have little pots with plants that sort of flank the door into the admission area at Barley Hall.
I'm never going to look at the courtyard quite the same again. You've got something a bit more on theme for Jorvik for our next medieval artifact, isn't that right?
The toilet seat or seats from Coppergate, we did used to feature an image of one of the toilet seats inside the Jorvik Viking Centre. So I remember when I was working front of house at Jorvik, so this is back in 2004, 2005, that sort of period, we did have an image in the sort of the orientation area, which was made to look a bit like a dig site or the outside of a dig site. We did have a picture of one of these toilet seats on display, but it doesn't strictly belong to the Viking period. It's thought to be of the 12th century. And there are two examples. You can tell exactly what it is just by looking at it. It's a thick plank with a bottom-shaped hole right in the middle of it. So you can imagine exactly what they were used for. Essentially, they were mounted over a pit, and then you could sit on them exactly as you would any other toilet seat, and do exactly as you would while sitting on any other toilet seat. I don't need to go into too much detail. So they're both made of thick oak planks, about 1 metre in length. One of the names that's sometimes used to describe the toilet in the medieval period is a garderobe, and one of them was found inside a pit, and perhaps it's the pit that it was used over, and maybe the seat has tumbled into it at some point, and that's how it's been lost and how its working life has ended. They were conserved in the same way as the other historic timbers from Coppergate, and I believe in a future episode you'll be hearing more from our conservation team about the measures that were taken to conserve the wooden items from Coppergate. The toilet seat in the medieval period, it doesn't have to be what's known as a single holer. You can have a triple holer as well. It's 3 holes in a row. So presumably you are increasing the capacity of your toilet so it can be used by multiple visitors in one sitting, and you're in no danger of being lonely. You can sit there and take care of business in company, possibly if you're sitting in the middle with a friend either side of you. So the mind boggles, really, doesn't it?
I can't say that I would be excited to use a toilet that was quite so communal, but to each their own. We've got something a little less gross now, but just as interesting. It looks like a triangle piece of leather with a thin strap attached to it. What can you tell us about this artifact, Chris?
There is an item that's been identified as an archer's bracer. Now, I don't know a great deal about archery, but I understand that this is worn on the inside of the arm so that when you draw the bowstring and then release it, it doesn't scrape painfully along the inside of your arm, that sort of tender bit of skin on the inside of your arm next to your wrist. It's an example of recycling. It was found amongst lots of leather offcuts and waste and other bits of recycled leather material. And it seems at an earlier point in its life to have been a shoe, specifically a long shoe known as a poulain type of shoe, fashionable in the later 14th century. A sort of pointy-toed variety with a toe that could sometimes extend up to 100 millimeters beyond the tip of the big toe. So these are really showy pieces of footwear. And if you look closely at the bracer, you can see that enough of the original shoe remains to show that it was fastened with a buckle and loop over the instep. But the way in which it has come down to us is in its recycled form as an archer's bracer.
Between recycling items like this and also using less open pits like you talked about before, it sounds like medieval Coppergate was pretty clean and an eco-friendly place. But our next artifact is something a bit fancier. Can you tell us about the ampulla, Chris?
The ampulla it belongs to a kind of find that's found fairly commonly in medieval sites throughout England. An ampulla is a small vessel made of pewter or tin, normally roughly flask-shaped, and it would at one time have held liquid contents, possibly water or oil, specifically holy water or holy oil that has at some point come into contact with a saint or a saint's shrine. And these were picked up or purchased by pilgrims. So a pilgrim going to one of the important pilgrimage sites would often collect souvenirs to either then act as talisman or a focus for prayer and other kinds of devotional activities. Ampullae, which is the plural of ampulla, ampullae were a way of carrying away some holy water from a shrine that you had visited. And in York, the principal shrine in the pre-Reformation period was that of St. William, who was a 12th century Archbishop of York, who was canonized as a saint. And you can visit bits of his shrine. Certainly, it was broken up just ahead of Henry VIII's visit to the city in the 1540s, and lumps of it ended up hidden in various parts of the city. But those bits that have been recovered and could be pieced back together show that it was a really substantial structure. And there were several shrines that stood on that site, and it was the latest of those that was broken up before Henry VIII visited. And you can see bits of it on display in the Yorkshire Museum. Many ampullae and pilgrim badges associated with Thomas Becket, who is the saint whose shrine you visit at Canterbury, which is the premier pilgrimage site in England. Lots of those have been recovered. but only 2 associated with St. William that have been found at Coppergate seem to have survived, although no doubt lots of these would have been made in large numbers in York. The figure of the Archbishop who appears on the ampulla is probably Archbishop William, and there are also figures on there that have been identified as Saints Peter and Paul, so 2 New Testament saints who often appear in company, in combination. And of course, York Minster is dedicated to St. Peter, and that's a long-standing dedication as well.
That's interesting. I didn't even realize that we had a saint from here in York. Our final one, I think, is one of your favorites. Can you tell us about the brazier?
The brazier wasn't actually found at the Coppergate site, which is normally given the address 16 to 22 Coppergate. It was found in the much wider area, somewhere in that much wider area covered by the watching brief that was run by York Archaeological Trust around the time of the Coppergate excavation. So it's not an item that I don't think many of my colleagues are very familiar with this particular item, but it's one that really stood out to me because I'm often thinking about our reconstructed medieval townhouse, Barley Hall, and it's got very, very high ceilings, and it must have been very difficult to heat the rooms during the medieval period. It's cold there in the 21st century, so in the 14th and 15th centuries, it must have been chilly and difficult to warm. The high ceilings really were an expression of high status. If you could have a dwelling with very high ceilings, it meant that you could afford to burn lots of fuel to keep your house warm. But how do you do that in an upstairs room, in a bed chamber? You can't have an open hearth, as we do in the Great Hall at Barley Hall. So instead, you need something probably portable and also that's going to be self-contained and safe from a fire safety point of view as well. So if you're setting it up on a planked floor, it needs to stand clear of the floor and burn away. And this is when you get something like a portable brazier. And this is what was found in 15th to 16th century dumped soil. And it's decorated as well. It's decorated with a cast 4-legged animal with a large snout and tail, while one of the longer sides of the brazier has got some simple open work and a large perforation, as well as stamped ring and dot motifs. Both of the less intact sides seem to have had open work within them as well. So it's a piece that I think deserves to be better known. The interpretation of it given by the archaeologists who've examined it are that it's either a brazier or a food warmer, but certainly the kind of item that you might have found possibly in a higher status medieval household. I'd love to get to know it better, and I'd love to see something like it reconstructed and installed at Barley Hall.
I'd love seeing something like that at Barley Hall too. Thanks for telling us about these fascinating finds, Chris. As we said at the top of the episode, there were also some Victorian and Roman finds that were excavated. Most of the Victorian levels were scraped away to get to the earlier levels, and so not much was found there. However, there was a pit full of Victorian dental casts. This leads us to believe that a dentist was working on Coppergate for a time. At the other end of the spectrum, the Roman levels were turning out to be just as interesting as the Viking levels. In fact, it seems there was a large Roman cemetery here at Coppergate. We don't actually know how large the cemetery was, as it extended past the excavation site on the northwest and southwest sides. We do know it was one of 3 Roman burials on this side of the fortress, which was located where the York Minster is today. We found 6 burials known as inhumations and 1 empty grave. Only half of the graves were buried with anything. One burial had glass beads and a jet finger ring, while another had a coin placed beneath its skull. A third burial had a coin placed next to one leg and 2 pairs of hobnail shoes next to one of the feet. The leather from these shoes had rotted away, unfortunately, but the nails from the bottom of the shoes were left behind in the soil, leaving a perfect boot print for archaeologists to find. Today, we're trading our high-vis vests for lab coats to learn more about the science of the soil and the conservation techniques that our team still use today to preserve these fantastic finds. We'll be talking to Ian Panter, Head of Conservation here at York Archaeological Trust, who has actually worked on conserving Coppergate. You might notice I said conserve and not restore. As we talked about in our Viking Finds episode this season, there's a difference between conservation and restoration. In restoration, specialists are trying to bring an artifact back to its original appearance and form. A lot of times that means filling in the broken parts or adding new bits altogether. For conservation, specialists work to maintain the artifact as it is so that future generations can see the whole story of the artifact, not just the original creation of it. A lot of times, a particular item is used multiple times in multiple ways. At Coppergate, Roman bricks were reused during Viking times to line hearths, pottery kilns, and blacksmith forges. If we decided to restore these bricks, part of the brick's story would be lost. But if we conserve the bricks, archaeologists and visitors alike can learn how Vikings recycled material around them and how the Romans made the bricks in the first place. Since we want you to know as much of the story as possible, we have a conservation department here at York Archaeological Trust. And of course, the leader of that department is with us today. We actually went over to the conservation lab to chat with Ian for this episode. Hi Ian, thanks so much for speaking with us today. In our first episode, we mentioned that it was the soil at Coppergate that preserved these finds. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes the soil so special?
Yeah, basically it's waterlogged because it's sort of medieval, Viking, medieval, in fact, right back to the Roman times, York, the settlement at York has been between two rivers, the land, the confluence of the River Ouse and the River Foss. So we've got a lot of waterlogged deposits, and it's the water that gives the preservation of the organic material, because if you imagine the water's filling the soil, the voids, the spaces within the soil, the air that's normally there in sort of normal soil is no longer there. It's been replaced by the water. So because you've got low oxygen or no oxygen, then any sort of microbes or bacteria, molds, things like that tend to digest organic material, they no longer live there. So you get fantastic preservation of organic material.
So if it's the water surrounding the artifacts that preserves them, what happens when the archaeologists remove the artifacts from the wet soil?
They have to keep everything wet as they're digging down through the layers and before they remove everything. So really it's sort of having to sort of spray the soil as they're excavating, keep everything wet. And if there's anything fragile and vulnerable, then call the conservators in and lift the items, get them into the conservation lab, where we can sort of put them into tanks and containers and keep everything underwater, and that will then stop everything, further decay occurring. We may have to use sort of chemicals to try and sort of control biological activity in those tanks while the items are under storage as well.
There's a really great sound clip of someone talking about how Richard Hall was always going around Coppergate shouting, "Keep that wood wet!" In the 1970s, archaeologists didn't really have a ton of experience preserving items on site, so what techniques did they come up with to prevent further damage to the artifacts?
It's quite a few interesting techniques, actually, that there's been a sort of a range of processes that have been used, from sort of creosote that we used to apply to fences before we suddenly realised it was toxic.
No.
Yeah, it's a banned item now. You can't sort of coat your fence in creosote because I think it gives you cancer, but there are a number of log boats that were preserved that way. But we were experimenting with a technique called acetone rosin, which was highly dangerous because it involved heating the acetone to a high temperature to get the rosin, which is a natural tree resin. It's like amber, so you need to get that into solution in the acetone. The only way to do that is to heat it, and the flash point of acetone is about 17 degrees centigrade, so you've got to be very careful because it could explode. So we had a facility in our old laboratory which was designed to do that, but all our lights and all our switches had to be spark proof, because with the volume of acetone we had, if the switch came in the first thing in the morning, switch the light on, then it could go boom. So and at that time we were at the back of Peter Adamant's garden, in effect, so he obviously didn't want to lose his house. So we were sort of using those sorts of techniques, but at that time, I guess in the late 70s, early 80s, and the Scandinavians were experimenting with peg wax on their Viking longships and such things. So we sort of really sort of followed what they were doing and adopted the techniques.
Is that what we still do today then?
We do, that's right. Yeah. So what we started off doing back in the sort of, I guess, the early 80s, and all the Coppergate house timbers that are on display, those were all treated with polyethylene glycol, but we took those up to around about 80-90% peg wax, and then we slowly air dried them. In actual fact, they were slow air dried actually within JORVIK 1, because the timetable for getting them off-site, getting them conserved and on display in the first Jorvik was quite tight. Jim and his team at that point had to take them out of the treatment tank, take them down to Jorvik and put them on display and let them slowly air dry there.
Oh, wow.
He did some monitoring of it, and there's very little movement of the timbers.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite good then.
It was actually, yes, quite encouraging. But the process we use now is freeze drying, and you use less polyethylene glycol wax when you're freeze drying. So freeze dried timbers look more natural. They've got a sort of brownier colour, whereas you notice that the Coppergate timbers, which are air dried, they look black and feel quite waxy.
In our first episode this season, Tales from the Trenches, we heard Jim Spriggs talk about setting up the first conservation lab at Coppergate. In case you missed it, here it is again.
I arrived in York one gloomy October day in 1972 to take up my post as conservator at the newly founded York Archaeological Trust, with very little idea of what to expect. I was familiar with excavations, having done lots of digging previously, but had no experience on how to set up a laboratory and little idea on how to staff and run one. My first permanent conservation lab was 2 small basement rooms in St Mary's Lodge on Marygate, which were dark, damp and prone to flooding. But I and my gradually expanding staff and students managed to survive down there for almost 8 years. Equipment was begged and borrowed from various places, including some lovely solid mahogany benches originally from the food department in Woolworths. The waterlogging at Coppergate had caused the spectacular survival of the original timbers and wattle and daub that made up the buildings and structures that stood on the site in the Viking period. For me, the excitement was slowly tempered by the realisation that I was chiefly responsible for looking after all this wood, both on site during excavation, then getting it lifted and stored safely, and probably then also conserving it permanently. There was little experience within the UK at the time on how to deal with waterlogged materials en masse after lifting, but common sense told us that what we were going to need was a lot of tanks to store everything in, supported and packed to avoid damage and underwater. So we started to build tanks out of wood lined with plastic, then out of fiberglass, and finally, for the larger timbers over a metre or so in length, we got the use of a huge outdoor concrete-lined wartime fire reserve tank on Clifton Aerodrome. There was an old wartime petrol-driven fire pump kept on site for emergencies that came in very handy when we needed to pump the thousands of gallons of water out of the tank for cleaning and maintenance, or, much later on, for selecting timbers for conservation.
You can hear more from Jim, as well as other people who worked on the Coppergate excavation, in that episode, so give it a listen after this one, of course. Jim Spriggs was instrumental in not only setting up the conservation lab, but also coming up with new techniques for conserving all of these organic materials. Can you tell us more about these conservation techniques?
Yeah, it's quite informative that Jim, I think, was the first member of staff appointed by Peter Addyman who realised the importance of conservation. So, especially when you're working in an area with waterlogged deposits. So yeah, Jim was at the cutting edge, and I think he was mad enough to develop the acetone rosin process into what it was at that time. He had the nerve to deal with that, and then he started developing other techniques for treatment of leather using polyethylene glycol, certain grade of polyethylene glycol wax, which is a liquid at room temperature. And then he started to use glycerol, again similar to, I think it is the food preservative that's used in food processing. We now use that for glycerol. So Jim was, he was instrumental in developing quite a few techniques.
While researching this episode, we've come across a lot of pictures of Jim in these big tanks where they were keeping huge timbers and other artifacts wet. You can see some of these pictures on our Instagram at JORVIK Viking. We've even got a clip of him talking about these tanks.
There was little experience within the UK at the time on how to deal with waterlogged materials en masse after lifting, but common sense told us that what we were going to need was a lot of tanks to store everything in, supported and packed to avoid damage and underwater. So we started to build tanks out of wood lined with plastic, then out of fiberglass, and finally, for the larger timbers over a metre or so in length, we got the use of a huge outdoor concrete-lined wartime fire reserve tank on Clifton Aerodrome. There was an old wartime petrol-driven fire pump kept on site for emergencies that came in very handy when we needed to pump the thousands of gallons of water out of the tank for cleaning and maintenance, or, much later on, for selecting timbers for conservation.
Oh gosh, yes, that was the it was the firefighting tank up at Clifton Airfield.
Yeah.
Which is no longer there. It's now housing estate.
Oh really?
But Jim and I had to go in. I think it must have been about 98, 99 because they'd sold off it was being used as a grain store, and they'd sold that off to the housing developers, who then contacted us and said, I think you got timbers in this tank. So Jim and I went in there and fished out all this old Coppergate timber.
Oh my goodness.
There were also timbers that had been recovered from the Minster in the Minster fire in 1984, so he took those out. It wasn't very pleasant.
Not ideal.
And I was just thinking, just Jim and I in there, health and safety nightmare. But we got everything out, and everything was in fantastic condition.
Wow, even still, it was amazing. Was there any sort of monitoring then in between when they were originally put in there and the?
No, I think Jim put them in there thinking he'd be retired before we had to get them out. He had no intention of getting them out. It was just that we were forced into it because the land had been sold. So he just put them in there. Everything was double wrapped in polythene and labelled, and they were in really good condition when they came out.
That's incredible.
It was.
Well, that the conservation's working then,
that's
don't
right.
you?
Yes, that's right. Because we also had a series of up to about 10 or 12 glass fibre tanks behind the art gallery. Again, that's all been developed. It's all part of the art gallery now. There used to be, there's at the back of the art gallery, in between the art gallery and the wall of the abbey, there was a series of prefabs that was part of the I think it was the Canadian Air Force buildings that they had during the Second World War, and there's a bit of land there that he had tanks on. And I remember it always used to get overgrown, so when he'd say you've got to go and get these timbers out of the tanks, he'd bring his machete in that he used in Belize, and we'd spend a day sort of chopping down the vegetation.
Oh my goodness.
Before we could actually get into the tanks. So,
oh my gosh.
And he had everything there from Coppergate right the way through to the Roman timbers from Queen's Hotel and such like. So he had quite a few of the old favourites in there.
Wow, that's incredible. I love that. It seems like, especially right at the beginning, it was everything, like the space that we used and the equipment we used was a bit beg, borrowed and stolen, sort of thing.
It was, yes. Jim was great for quite annoying actually at times. He'd be coming to work or at lunchtime and he'd go past the skip and there'd be something in the skip and he'd pull it out and bring it in. One day it'd be nice to have some really a brand new laboratory.
Yeah.
But that was the way things were done in those days.
Yeah.
And I mean, we would if we didn't have to buy something, if we could convince the developer to or whoever to donate something to us, then that's the way we'd go.
All the better, yeah.
Yeah. In actual fact, our first freeze dryer, a very small freeze dryer, I think that was donated to us from Hato, which was a Danish company, and it was the Danish Queen who's I think she asked them to donate a small freeze dryer to us.
That's amazing.
It is, yeah.
We've got some really great pictures of her in the conservation lab as well, because she was a friend of Peter Adamans.
She was, yeah.
But she studied archaeology as well, so she's properly investigating everything and all the pictures and stuff. I love that she donated something as well, or had it arranged.
Yeah, so that's because I think I don't know what the cost of freeze dryers was back in that day, but it's expensive now, so something that the trust wouldn't be able to afford. So if they could get something given to them or part given, then that was all well and good. But that's how the lab was set up. It was,
I love it,
donations mainly. So and Jim's ability to find things in skip.
Sounds like a magpie. Yes.
His house is very tidy.
So what do we do as far as, especially conservation and things that today that's different than how things were done in the 70s then?
Actually, very little's changed. I mean, obviously we now use freeze drying more than say solvents because of the health and safety issues. So it's a no trying to do acetone rosin now. We tried to do it as cold, but it doesn't work as well. So we've sort of knocked that on the head, and it's mainly freeze drying. But it's also the techniques that were being developed back in the 60s and the 70s. We're now 40, 50 years of use. So we know how these materials react. And
You've perfected it.
Yeah, and that way we're beginning to see the problems with them now. So, we've learned a lot, and we still learn. But yeah, we tend to use the same sort of things. But yeah, I mean, it's the way conservation is actually. We're very sort of archaeology as well. We're working in the past, so we take things slowly.
So today, Yat has become really well known for its wood conservation. So what other projects have come your way that you've gotten to work on as far as wood conservation? You mentioned the Mary Rose.
Yeah, well, I mean, we haven't done any work for the Mary Rose, but I worked for the Mary Rose before coming up to York. So I was on the Mary Rose from 1980 to 86.
That's amazing.
A long time ago. Yeah, that was fun. I mean, just before the ship came up, and that was a good time. That again, we were doing stuff that had never been done before in the country, but using sort of looking at techniques that Scandinavian colleagues were developing.
A quick aside, since we haven't talked about the Mary Rose on this podcast before. The ship has its own fascinating history, but people mostly know it as the pride of the Navy during Henry VIII's reign. It was built in 1510 and sunk in 1545, and was a crucial part of several battles during that period. It was rediscovered in the 1960s, and marine archaeologists, who are trained to do excavations underwater in places like the North Sea or the Thames River, carefully dug the ship out of the silt from 1979 to 1982, which means it was going on at the same time as the Coppergate excavation. In 1982, the main section was carefully raised out of the sea and, of course, had to be conserved. Luckily for everyone, Ian was on hand as part of the conservation team.
But yeah, we do quite a lot of work, external work. I guess, and one of the more challenging ones for me at the moment is the project I'm doing in Sydney in Australia, which is what's known as the Barangaroo boat. And this was uncovered in around about 2018.
Right.
Sydney Metro, who are sort of government organisation, they're basically building a new metro system. So they were putting a new underground station in Barangaroo, which is on Darling Harbour, and found the remains of this boat, which it dates to around about the 1830s, 1840s. So in our time scanning, it's not very old.
Still quite cool, though.
It's very, for the Australians, it's very significant because there used to be a law in Australia that you weren't allowed to build boats, obviously, because because of your background. Then you might escape. So this is thought to be one of the first non-indigenous boats that's been built in Australia. It's all built out of Australian timber.
Wow. In
a very sort of rudimentary fashion by people who I think have seen boat building going on, but they've never done it themselves. They're almost like, I'd say, sort of cabinet makers, because you get a lot of little wooden dowels and very small nails being used in the construction. So I got approached to sort of help them set up a wood conservation centre in Sydney and oversee the conservation. Wow. So I went over there in 2019, and then COVID hit. So it's teaching these guys over there how to do wood conservation via Zoom in the early hours of the morning, and it's an interesting one. Got several projects over there now, because there's the Barangaroo boat, which is the most important one, and then there's what we call the Windsor boats. And there's about three. They're not as significant or not as much as the Barangaroo boat, but this was. Again, a similar project, and a new bridge at Windsor going over the river, which was flooded actually. A few weeks ago they had horrendous rainfall, so they were flooding, and this new bridge they built was underwater.
Oh my God. Nightmare.
Yeah, so there's those ones as well, which I'm now looking after as well. So I hope to get back over there next year possibly.
We're definitely going to have to come back and hear about that. Today is our final episode on the Coppergate excavation. We've heard stories from the people who worked on the dig itself, and we've talked to people who work with the collection today. We've learned about the history of the dig, what was found, and how those artifacts are conserved. But the big question remains: why does it matter? To discuss that and more, we're talking to Sarah Maltby, Director of Attractions here at York Archaeological Trust. So the first question we've got for you is, before Coppergate, the history of Vikings in Britain was really focused on their invasion. Everyone saw them as warriors who were really only concerned with battle. But at Coppergate, we found very little evidence of that. So what kind of Vikings were living at Coppergate?
So they were everyday folk, really. They were families, they were craft workers, there were people who were possibly coming in from the countryside, possibly coming in from elsewhere, from across the North Sea, for example. But they were, as I say, they were everyday folk. They may have been warriors, who knows? In a past life, they may have come, fought, and then settled. But the evidence we found was predominantly, or exclusively, I guess, everyday living. It was houses, it was clothing, it was food, so that's why Coppergate was so important, because it was the first time that any archaeological excavation had found that extent of everyday life, really.
That kind of reminds me of the interview I did with Judith Jesh, where she kind of was saying like how we do have this image of like burly men as fighters and everything, but of course that doesn't represent all of the Viking men, first of all, but even the other half of everyone else. So it is good that I think we found all of that evidence at Coppergate. So then, if all of these ordinary folks were living at Coppergate, where did they come from? Were they just from Scandinavia, or did they come from elsewhere as well?
Well, we think probably some of them were there already. It was already a city. It had been established by the Romans, as we know, as Iberacum. It continued through the years after that. We don't know a great deal about the Anglo-Saxon population of York, or JORVIK, as it was known then. We know some, and we're hoping to find out more as a trust as we dig more sites in York. But certainly there would have been people that have been living there for generations, I would have thought. But yes, there were people there from the isotopic work that we've done, and certainly if you take one of the skeletons that we excavated in Coppergate, and there were only 2 complete skeletons that we found from the Viking Age period in Coppergate. This was a female who we have done a lot of scientific analysis on. We know a lot about her in terms of her stature, sort of the things that she suffered from, because she did have various impairments and difficulties, I would say. But we also know that she came from Norway in the work that we've done, which is fantastic to know that, we were getting a population from across Europe. But we also think that our population in York, as it is now, was made up of people from across the world who were travelling, those who were able to travel anyway. We know, having looked at other collections of human remains in York, and York and Coppergate is just a small collection, as I've said, that there were people from other cultures, from other countries, not necessarily first generation. So we have a skeleton again in JORVIK who shows signs of being of African descent, but we don't know if that's first generation or second or third, because we're assuming that people from other countries did come across with the Romans. So who knows? It's just very interesting to note, I think, that based on the skeletal evidence and also the trading evidence that we have, that the population of York in the time of the Vikings was a very diverse one. And I think that's really interesting to remember and to focus on when we think about the world today, I guess.
Definitely. It makes it feel less foreign. If we look at the people from the past and they look like our society does now, it doesn't feel like they were that far away after all, does it?
Exactly. And they, probably had the same concerns and everything else that we worry about today. Not quite sure if they would worry about a pandemic, but yeah, they would have been, I hope and think, fairly similar to us.
So in that kind of same vein then, simple everyday folks sort of thing like us, what kind of jobs did we find evidence for? What did they do for their livings?
Well, we have a lot of craftspeople. So a huge proportion of the evidence that we have is for crafts such as blacksmithing, wood turning, leather working. So we have that, and particularly in the reconstructions, because of the evidence that we found on this particular part of Coppergate, we've got this craft working centre, really. So we do have those people, and the evidence that we have to reflect that are things like, in terms of woodworking, for example, we have the bowls and we have the cups in the record, which is an exciting thing because they're not often left. But we also have the waste, and that's why we know that we have these craftspeople working on that spot. It's not just a finished item that people perhaps have discarded or used in their homes and then tossed to one side or whatever. It's actually the waste that comes from manufacturing these things. So we have blacksmithing waste. We have the remains of ironworking, etc. In the fireplaces. We have, as I say, say, wood cores from bowls. We have offcuts of leather and bone and antler. So we know all these people were working in Coppergate, but we also suspect and know that, there were fishermen. We have evidence of fishing, we have fishing hooks, and we have thousands upon thousands of fish bones. So we know people were eating fish and mussels and oysters and all that kind of thing. So there were fishermen bringing fish in from the sea as well as the rivers. Obviously, York stands on the Ouse and the Foss, so we know that there's a lot of fishing going on. So we have those kind of industries as well. And then, the women in the home, they had their own jobs to do. So that, again, we mustn't forget that was really important because, we have a lot of evidence for textiles and textile working. So things like loom weights and textiles themselves, actually. So we know that these kind of occupations were going on in the home and that women played a very important part in all of that, producing these textiles that have been used for clothing or blankets. So, all really important parts of Viking life, if you like, that all came together to build this culture that is then left in the archaeological record for us.
I love that you mentioned the textile work because people wouldn't necessarily think about that when thinking of a traditional job. But of course, making fabric is very time consuming, as much as any full-time job would be. That's definitely great to consider as well. That is another aspect of their lives. And God, I couldn't do it. One article of clothing taking weeks to make would just about take it out of me, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, really important, I think. And we mustn't forget that. And, it wasn't just the big cloth, the fabric, that they're making into clothes, obviously. But, all of that intricate decoration, like the tablet weaving, which they would have used to edge the edges of clothing, cloaks, etc. The knoll binding, we have in Jorvik the only Viking sock remaining, which people should come and see. If they haven't seen the Viking sock, they need to come and see it because it is a unique object and it's been made really carefully. It's been darned by somebody really carefully. It has this red band on it, so it probably had a red leg. And that when you think about it, as you say, loads of work into that. I've never tried nail binding. I've seen our Vikings do it and it looks complicated and I don't think I could do it. Similarly, the tablet weaving, again, beautiful things that can be produced by just, this sort of thread and cards, some of which we've got left in the archaeological record. It's really important and gives a real depth, I think, to who the Vikings were, what they looked like, what was important to them, that kind of thing, I think.
Definitely. On that kind of similar note then, we found loads of rubbish at Coppergate, of course. That's, the majority of what archaeologists tend to find. A lot of it was from food production and consumption. So you mentioned fish and things like that. What else do we know was being eaten at Coppergate?
Well, quite a variety. I should say, of course, archaeology is rubbish. Everybody says that. So it is really important. And the reason why we know a lot about the Vikings who lived in Jorvik at that time is because of that environmental waste that has been preserved in the soil. So, as you say, we have fish. And fish is a really interesting one because if you look at fish bones, actually, because it brings up other subjects. If you look at the fish bones over time and, a few hundred years that the Vikings were in York, they get smaller. So actually the Vikings were overfishing, which is an interesting thing to think about today in terms of overfishing stocks, now. So cod, which we've got a lot of bones from, got smaller over the 200-300 years that the Vikings were in York. So fish, yes. Oysters, sort of shellfish, which we would think of a fairly exclusive and rich food nowadays, I think, but they're eating a lot of those. But then meat, we've got an awful lot of animal bone and also cooked animal bone to show that they were cooking it. So, cattle, beef, sheep, pork, all of the sort of regular foodstuffs, if you like. But then we've got odd things like guillemot, which I always found fascinating. We've got bones from guillemot. So were they eating them? We don't know. But possibly, we have a lot of different animal and bird bones. We've got chicken, we've got eggs. We've done a lot of work on eggshell recently, actually. We worked with York University to look at our animal remains in particular. And we've done a project on eggshell so we can tell what sort of chickens they had in Jorvik at the time. So there's all these type of things that you can find out from this very minute evidence. I mean, we have seed crops, we have cereal, we have evidence that they were drinking beer, wine. It's a really, rich diet, I suppose. A lot of things wouldn't have necessarily been grown in the city, may have been grown outside the city and then brought in, we think, by trade. So yeah, it's I think really interesting when you look at the foodstuffs. And of course, from that you go into our coprolite that is now shown in Jorvik. It was actually from Lloyd's Bank excavation, and in that you can actually see what people ate as well. So it's not just the food evidence that shows you what people ate, it's other evidence as well. So the coprolite poo, if you like, shows you that they were eating grain, and also that this particular individual who deposited this coprolite suffered from various intestinal worms as well. So we know that. And then when we look at pots, the other sort of evidence that you can find when you look at pottery from the period, again using archaeological science, we can tell what they were cooking in those pots through the lipids that are left in the pots, the fats. So recent studies, for example, we've looked at certain pots from the Coppergate excavation and found that they were cooking meaty stews and leafy vegetables. All very obvious stuff, I suppose, but it's really nice to have that confirmed when you do the scientific analysis. So it's not only, as I say, the food remains, I suppose, that you find in the archaeological record, but it's other evidence that you finding on other material that you might be digging up as well.
I love the whole lipid thing. I'm not much of a science person, but so that just absolutely blows my mind anytime I hear about it, that just by looking at 1,000-year-old pot, you can know what was cooked inside of it. That's incredible. Yeah. Absolutely incredible. So we excavated 4 tenements on Coppergate, places that were combined houses and workshops. What were the houses like, and did they change at all over time?
They did change. So early period were these wattle houses. So that's very, very early, that were kind of 1 story, although there is a big debate about whether later houses were 1 or 2 stories. That's something that's still kind of out there in the archaeological realms of discussion. But the early houses were wattle, there were single room, single height, and we have a lot of evidence for those. We then have this point in time, which is around about 960, when we moved from those wattle houses to timber houses, using planks and boards. And it's a really interesting, and it's work that we did and looked at when we refurbished Jorvik after the flood, when we totally had to rebuild Jorvik. We redated the reconstruction to around 960 AD, which is the period that the housing changed from this wattle structure to this timber frame structure. And that date actually also coincides when Eric Bloodaxe, who was the last Viking king in Jorvik, got thrown out of Jorvik. So there is an idea that actually coincided then, that change in buildings coincided with the changing leadership. So he was thrown out, different earls came in, there was a new sort of land ownership, a new way of doing things, and therefore they cleared all of those original early houses and started to build this new design. So we've got both. When we look at the archaeological record, when we did the excavation, we found both. And I think some of the most exciting photographs, actually, when you look at Coppergate, the archive of Coppergate, the excavation, is seeing those timbers still in the ground, sort of 2-3 foot high. And you just think, they are 1,000-year-old buildings sitting there in the mud still for us to see. And I love looking at those photographs because they're just fascinating, to have all that timber there. And when you go into Jorvik, and one of the first things you see is an actual timber wall that we excavated, and you can get up, you can virtually press your nose against it. So I think that's great. I think it's I just think it's really interesting. But that's what we've got, a whole sort of period and change in housing.
I love those pictures as well, because it does look like that you're basically just inside of someone's house, more or less, or like it's being built around you. It like the timbers look like you could basically build a house out of them now. It's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. They look solid. I don't think they are, because they're actually full of peg wax. And, when we conserve them, because actually when we dug them up, we were one of the first organisations to conserve the timbers in that way, which another story for another time, perhaps.
So obviously a lot of Coppergate was about getting this better kind of well-rounded image of what Viking life was like. And of course, life includes children. So what evidence do we have for children at Coppergate, and what were they doing?
We don't have any sort of skeletal evidence, any human remains of children. We assume children must have been there because the Vikings were here for 200 odd years. So there must have been children at some point. What we do have is gaming evidence. We have Nefertafel gaming pieces, Nefertafel, which is early form of chess, really. So games were being played. We have a really interesting find, which is actually from a grave. It's part of a coffin lid, I guess. And on that somebody has etched in a kind of fox and geese solitaire game into that, and we have that in the collection to see. So I don't know if that was children playing that. We don't know. It's a fascinating story, but we've not really concluded what that is. We have ice skates, but again, I don't think they're confined to sort of children. We have adult-sized ice skates. Oh, we do have small shoes, actually. One of the things we do have is a small child-sized leather shoe, which is nice, and we have a lot of shoes in the collection, which is unique to Coppergate because of the conditions of the soil. But yeah, a really nice child's shoe, which you can see in JORVIK. So a few pieces. I mean, we just have to assume that the children were there, that they had a part to play. And we've looked at things like what would the children be doing, for example, in JORVIK in those days. And one of the things we talk about in DIG, actually, my sister attraction, is that children, for example, would be working in roles with some of the craftspeople. So we assume that the blacksmith, and actually we recreate this on the set, the blacksmith has his son next to him and he's kind of teaching him the ways of the blacksmith, and he's and that probably those younger family members were involved in those crafting, perhaps cleaning out the fires and that kind of thing. So we make assumptions, but I think they're assumptions that are quite sensible, should I say, because they must have been doing those sorts of things.
So overall, Coppergate really significantly changed the way that people viewed the Vikings. Can you maybe sum up for us how it might have been before and then how it was after? How did our perception of Vikings change directly because of Coppergate?
Well, I think the first thing to say is actually the excavation on Coppergate changed the way that people thought about York, because before we did the excavations on Coppergate, before we found all those remarkable finds from the Viking Age, York was mainly thought of as a Roman city. It has got Roman roots, obviously, but I think before we did the excavation, that was the predominant period in York's history that was recognised as the important one. And actually, when we dug Coppergate, that changed everybody's perception. And York now very much, I would argue, is a Viking city. And I think that is, well, I know it is to do with Coppergate because it was so important at the time and did change everybody's perception of the city itself. But from a subject point of view, I think, again, because we found the evidence that was every day, we haven't actually found a weapon in Coppergate. We've got an axe head, but that was probably, for chopping wood or whatever. But we haven't got weapons. We do show weapons in JORVIK, but they're from a collection from the British Museum. They were found down in the Thames. So I think before we found all that evidence and all that fantastic detail, intricate detail about Vikings' lives, it was very much this perception of big burly blokes with horns on their helmets and beards. And, the women didn't really get a look in. The children really didn't get a look in. And I think we've made people think, I really do. And I know when people come around JORVIK and look at the reconstruction, which is all based on the archaeology that we've done, I do think it changes people's minds. And as we talked earlier about this idea that JORVIK wasn't just, Vikings with beards and helmets or whatever, that it was this mix of cultures, this mix of people from across the world. Hopefully that's changing people's perceptions as well, that it was this melting pot of cultures and people, and I think that's what's really important, and one of the important things that JORVIK has achieved, that it's changed people's minds, and that's great. And I hope we can go on doing that, because we're finding more and more evidence. We're always digging things up as a trust, and we're always investigating things, whether that's working with the universities or doing our own research, our own conservation. And I think one of the big things about the York Archaeological Trust is that we can do that, and we continue to do that in the future.
Well, that actually ties in really nicely with my next question. So obviously our understanding of Vikings is still changing with new sciences as they develop and things, all these new techniques. We're constantly learning more information. So how has JORVIK changed since its original incarnation?
Well, it is interesting because we've got photographs going back to 1984. So, all the years that we've been open, and it's amusing and interesting to look at photographs. So Jorvik's had 4 different versions. We opened in 1984, as I said, first time around. We've always had a reconstruction of a ride of the Viking city, which has always been based on the archaeology that we found there. But obviously techniques and modelling and animatronics and how to replicate objects has changed. The ride itself has changed. We originally had one that ran on the ground. It was like a little box trolley. And now, of course, it's a suspended capsule that travels around the city. It's always been the same size. It's quite entertaining when you talk to people who remember the earlier versions of Jorvik. Some of them think it was bigger. It's never been bigger. It's always been that size. But I think people's perception changed over time. We've changed the galleries. I mean, the galleries have changed probably more than anything in Jorvik. Different themes. We've had all sorts of different themes in the galleries, from looking at burials to looking at a theme about, are you a Viking? Sort of looking at place names, looking at other remains. So that's changed quite a lot. So as I say, we've had 4 versions of Jorvik. The first opening in 1984, we changed again in 2000, opening in 2001. And that was a complete revamp again. Again, essentially the same thing, just done with new methods. We slightly changed in 2010, just putting in some new galleries, changing the narrative on the ride as new research had come in, and we felt that we needed to update things a little bit. And then most recently was in 2015-16, reopening in 2017, which is when, after Jorvik flooded at Christmas 2015. And again, it's the same size. We have changed things, again, based on new research. So we've included a lot more about the human remains because of the isotopic research that we can do now, DNA research that we can do now, and a lot of research on that environmental evidence that I've been talking about. So we put in new animatronics, for example, completely in 2016, working with a company from America who designed them with us so that we can get down to the most intricate detail on the figures that illustrate who the people were that lived there. And we put in a lot of other detail as well, I suppose, this last time around, again, based on the research. So, for example, in the part of the reconstruction where you're looking at textiles and dyeing, cloth, etc., we specifically researched the type of wool, what sort of sheep would it have come from, and we tracked and we found a species of sheep that exists today that generations ago would have lived in Viking times, the Herdwick. So we brought that in and we dyed those textiles with dyes that were based on the research that we've done on the dyeing evidence. So it's all authentic in that part of it. I mean, it's a lot of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily notice when you're going around the ride, first time around, second time around, but maybe third time around. So we've put in a lot more detail this time for this version of Jorvik. And we've also, of course, put live actors on the ride to portray our Vikings and train them to speak in Old Norse or Old English, which is very new. So we've done a lot of work on language this time around. I think the one thing that has remained current is our man on the toilet, of course. So we have always had a man on the toilet in Jorvik. He has evolved into a different figure each time, and this time he's actually got a roof on his toilet. So we've kept things the same, if you like, that have been really popular and we're known for. We've always had smells, for example. People know us for our smells, but this time around we put in a lot more smells. We actually designed new smells to put in to illustrate more parts of the story. So we've got in this version of Jorvik, for example, a deathbed scene where we have a priest. So we have an incense smell within that scene. So, we've introduced subtleties and new scenes and new evidence and new research, and we continue to do that.
So obviously Jorvik was a very multicultural place. There was a lot of trade and things like that happening. We still have those connections, don't we, with people from other countries, other museums. What do we learn from each other? How do we grow from that relationship?
Well, you're right. We do have really good relationships and networks within the Viking world, which is a vast world. We are part of an organisation called Destination Viking Association, which has about 50 members, across Scandinavia, but also into Poland and Spain and France and America and all over, really, wherever the Vikings got to, we have now partners. And that has been a really good network to understand, that wider framework, if you like, to the Viking world. So that relationship has been really important to us. Not only have we been able to see differences and add those into our story, but also similarities. So it's really interesting when you're talking to people from museums in Scandinavia and looking at their collections, you can see where influence have come from. And I think that's really, really interesting when you're looking at our collection of objects, that you can see where perhaps the influence for a brooch or something has come from, because you see a similar object in a collection overseas. We do have objects in our collection from Ireland, for example, Scandinavia. And when you go over to those countries, you can see where those objects have come from. So, those links are really important. So it's great to have friends in those countries because they bring a lot to the museum. They bring a different perspective. So I think that's the important bit, is widening the story by having those friends in different places that can tell different aspects of the story.
Definitely. Well, that brings us to our very last question then. Is there anything else that you specifically want our listeners to know about Jorvik?
So we've been closed, obviously, for the past year, more or less, on and off, but we are reopening on the 17th of May. We have had to implement a lot of safety measures, so things have changed slightly, but in all of this past year, what we've been really keen on is preserving the Jorvik visit, because I think we are known for the type of visit that we do. It's very interactive. You can talk to a Viking. Where else can you do that in this country? And we've been really keen through all of this, through the pandemic, to maintain that, because it is really important to us. So when people come back, they still will be able to talk to our Vikings, albeit through a mask initially, but they're there and you can find out about the objects. You can see those objects really close up. Yes, okay, at the moment we might not be handling those objects, but in the future we will be. The other thing that I think I need to talk about is the fact that actually now, because of the pandemic, we've done an awful lot digitally. So as well as coming to Jorvik physically, you can also come to Jorvik virtually. And that's been a real success story for the past few months, particularly for schools and learners learning at home, who can have an outreach in their own classroom and have a Viking talk to them directly. And I think that work that we've been doing over the past few months with our collection, with our team of Vikings, has been really important to keep people engaged in the physical Jorvik and to keep the stories alive, really. So we will keep going. We still want people to come back and visit us, whether that's physically or virtually. But, it still will be that same exciting Jorvik experience, which I hope everybody can enjoy.
We really hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into the Coppergate excavation. If you want to learn more, why not visit in person? Book your tickets now at jorvikvikingcenter.co.uk. Come see where it all happened and check out these amazing finds for yourself. You'll even be able to speak to one of our Viking interpreters and learn more about Viking Age York. That's it for this season. Thank you once again to Rachel Cutler, Chris Tuckley, Ian Panter, and Sarah Maltby for coming on the show, and to Lucas Norton and Max O'Keefe for research assistance. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. We're moving on into a fortnightly release schedule for the next couple of months, but stay tuned as we talk to our fascinating guests such as Bruni Boast, John Airy, and Matt Lewis. Check out our Instagram at Jorvik Viking for hints about all of their episodes. Thanks for listening to that Jorvik Viking Thing podcast. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support that Jorvik Viking Thing, please visit jorvikthing.com to make a donation. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of that Jorvik Viking Thing podcast. That Jorvik Viking Thing podcast is a production of the Jorvik Group and the York Archaeological Trust. Researched by Miranda Schmiederer and Ashley Fisher. Written and produced by Ashley Fisher. Sound designed and edited by Miranda Schmiederer.